now 2 days away from Election Day, but that doesn't mean that we're going to know the results in 2 days or even necessarily next week. There have only been a few contested presidential elections in American history, but with millions casting their ballots early or through the mail, there is a greater chance that the battle over counting those votes could end up in a courtroom. Derek Muller joins me now. He is a professor of law at the University of Iowa, and he's going to answer all of the questions that we have about the possibility for a contested election. And to be honest with you, it's pretty wild to be discussing the what-if situation of a contested election before the election has taken place. But honestly, that's the truth of the contest that we're in. So thank you for joining us. And can you start us off by just telling us what kind of roadmap history provides when it comes to understanding contested elections?
Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, I think it's a fascinating time because of the high degree of uncertainty. And when there's high degrees of uncertainty, we start to think about all of the unexpected outcomes that could happen. So in 1800, there was a tie in the presidential election, and Congress had to choose a president. And in 1824, there was no candidate who received the majority of the electoral votes. And so Congress had to choose a president there. In 1876, there was a hotly contested election. Multiple states said the Republican won, no, the Democrat won. They sent their results to Congress. Congress had to choose among them, created a commission, essentially reaching a bargain to try to ultimately pick a president at the end of the day. And then, of course, we can think about 2000, where a lot of these other challenges happened in the political process. 2000 played out in a courtroom as there was a recount and challenges in the state of Florida, ultimately culminating in the Supreme Court's decision in Bush versus Gore. So we can think about all kinds of different contests of presidential elections throughout history, but each one is unique. Each one can offer us a little window into the past, but it doesn't necessarily tell us what's going to happen in the future.
All right. Give us a review of some of these important decisions. I mentioned in the introduction that already there's been a lot of litigation about this election, and the Supreme Court has already made some rulings concerning Election Day. Talk to us about those and if there are any upcoming decisions on the docket which could impact the results of this race.
Yeah, so right now the Supreme Court has been sort of handling these cases on an emergency basis. So it hasn't had oral argument. It hasn't sort of had full briefing from the parties to make decisions. So these have been essentially sort of stopgap measures from the Supreme Court to say, let's just hold things in place and we'll see what happens after the election. For the most part, this has been a mixed bag. In some cases, like in Wisconsin, there was a question about extending ballot deadlines, or in Alabama, there was a question about extending curbside voting. In those cases, the court said, no, you didn't have those rules in place before. Let's kind of hold on to them. Let's keep them in place. In other places like Pennsylvania, where they did extend some voting to allow ballots that were received up to 3 days after Election Day, including those without a postmark, or in North Carolina, ballots up until 9 days after Election Day. There was litigation, and in those cases, the Supreme Court said, we're going to let those decisions stand and the new rules will take effect. So it's really been a series of divided decisions, a number of opinions where the members of the court are sort of jockeying with each other, trying to figure out what's going to happen down the line. But for the most part, sort of we've seen this sort of division. So right now, everything's pretty calm. There might be a case out of Texas in the near future. We're not sure. But until then, we'll see what happens after Election Day. Many of these cases have sort of been held on an emergency basis. If there's sort of a need to revisit them, the court might have the opportunity to do so after Election Day. It all depends on how close it is.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your state of Iowa, my home state. It's also contested, and the plan is to have all absentee ballots counted by 10 p.m. Derek, how likely do you think that is? Do you expect any challenges?
Yeah, I think the people of Iowa, in the heartland here, they're working as hard as they can to make sure that everything's going to be ready on Election Day. And what's really essential in a state like Iowa with its 99 counties, but also around the country, it's county auditors or county commissioners or those county election officials who are really working their hardest and their fastest to expedite this information. That is, they're trying to pre-canvass these votes on election night in the precincts where in-person voting has happened. And in virtually all states, there's processing of ballots ahead of Election Day. So all of the tens of millions of absentee ballots that have already been mailed in and received in the states, most states are already processing those, taking a look to make sure the signatures match, that they're from a valid person, that and everything's completed on them. so that on election day we can run them as quickly as possible through the machine. So I'm optimistic, especially in a state like Iowa, where they've been preparing and anticipating for these things for many months. The Secretary of State working hand in hand with the county auditors here. And hopefully we'll have a lot of information. Now, there's no guarantee, right? There's always some uncertainty that can arise. In many states, ballots can still arrive and be counted after Election Day. But hopefully we'll have a lot of information on election night.
Well, it is complicated by the fact that because of the pandemic, tens of millions of Americans have already voted. And still, many people are not going to cast their ballots until Tuesday. So what's your idea of what a timeline could look like for getting in the official results?
Right, so most states have a timeline to sort of finalize the official results in the state by late November. Some of them might be a little bit earlier. Some of them might trickle into December. States like California usually take a little bit longer. But for all of these states, there's sort of various stages of results. There's sort of a preliminary results that are released election night or as quickly thereafter. There's sometimes an interim result that happens from the canvass that occurs in the counties. And then finally, the Secretary of State, once having all of those sort of finalized results, will provide that final figure. But really, a couple of deadlines to be looking for in the future for the presidential election in particular. One is December 8th, which is the safe harbor deadline, which is a goal states usually look for because that's the time when Congress says, we'd like you to have your act together, states. That's the date where if you finish your counting and resolve all your disputes, we're going to presume that your electoral votes are regular. But most important is December 14th. That's when the presidential electors actually meet in the 50 states and in the District of Columbia. All those votes that we cast on Election Day are going to be counted with an eye toward the electors meeting December 14th. So that's several weeks after Election Day, but gives you an idea that there's still ample time to resolve any disputes that might crop up.
I'm thinking about what you're saying now as well as your answer to my first question, and it seems like your impression, at least that you're leaving me and other viewers, I'm sure, is that there have been contested elections before and America has always gotten through it. But this is a little bit different. The president has indicated repeatedly that he thinks the only way that he could lose is if there's fraud. So what happens then if the president actually loses the election but he doesn't concede?
Well, I mean, the rest of government is going to say there's a new president, right? The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court will swear a new president on January 20th, whether that's Joe Biden or whether that's Donald Trump. And yeah, I think there's some uncertainty about what happens for a sore loser in a presidential election, I suppose. I think the most sort of contested election in American history really is not one of the ones we talked about as really contested on the election side. It's really the election of 1860, where merely the election of Abraham Lincoln was enough to cause a number of states to secede and essentially initiate the Civil War. So I like to keep it in perspective that I don't think we're at that stage yet. But there's no question that if there's a candidate who refuses to concede, it can lead to a lot of problems. We can think about Al Gore, who I think legitimately contested that election in 2000 for many, many weeks. And then it was only sort of on December 12th when the Supreme Court came out with its decision in Bush versus Gore that he stood down and said, that's it. There were a lot of questions about what happened if he had contested that further into Congress or beyond. But again, I think to the extent that there's this dispute that arises, Congress meets on January 6th, 2021, to count the electoral votes and announce its winner. And I think at least the majority and minority leaders of both chambers of Congress have said they plan on sticking by the election results. They plan on doing whatever happens out of that. So my hope is that the arms of government will work as they're designed to do, even if there might be some folks who are a little reluctant, whatever happens on November 3rd.
All right, Derek Muller, thank you.
Thanks for having me.